Good evening. War is evil as it costs blood and treasure, therefore, it must be avoided at all costs. But since time immemorial, thousands of wars have been fought to a devastating end. So, we are again witnessing yet another war, this time in Ukraine, after a frantic diplomatic efforts failed to avert the same. In the first 3 days of war, more than 200 precious lives, both civilian and military, have been lost, and property worth millions have been destroyed. High precision weapons have hit military infrastructure, air defense facilities, military airfields, aviation of the armed forces of Ukraine, and some civilian infrastructure. Interfax news agency quoted the Russian Defense Ministry as saying that Russian troops have destroyed 83 land-based Ukrainian targets and achieved all its goals. It was not specified whether the 83 targets included civilian infrastructure. Therefore, I see no justification for the war. But Russian President Vladimir Putin has scores of reasons for launching the war against Ukraine, some of which I discuss here. In an address announcing military operation against Ukraine carried on Russian state television early Thursday, Putin described the goal of military operation as ending the genocide against the people in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donbas, where Russia-backed separatists have been at war with Ukrainian forces since 2014. And to this end, we will strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. We will also bring to justice those who committed the numerous bloody crimes against the civilians, including citizens of Russian Federation. He said that Russia could no longer tolerate a Ukraine that had been taken hostage by forces hostile to Russia. The country cannot feel safe and develop and exist with a constant threat coming from the modern territory of Ukraine. Putin complained and justified the invasion, saying, "We simply weren't given any other option to defend Russia and our people other than that which we will use today." Putin has a long list of complaints against and demands from the West. His three key demands are no further NATO expansion to the east, including barring ex-Soviet states like Georgia and Ukraine's entry into NATO, no deployment of offensive weapons near Russian border, and rollback of NATO's military infrastructure in Europe to 1997 levels. But US President Joe Biden refused to give such an assurance. However, he was willing to discuss questions of strategic stability in Europe. Biden's logic was that Putin's demand infringed on the sovereignty of Ukraine. Besides, reeling under sagging approval rating just as he gears up for this year's congressional elections, Biden wanted victories elsewhere. Ukraine offered a good opportunity to arrest and improve his falling approval rating by standing up to Putin. Even as Biden refused to concede to the demands of Putin, he had made it clear that the United States would not intervene with its own troops if Russia invaded Ukraine. Biden's position has not changed even as the Russian troops are bombarding Ukraine. If this is the commitment of Biden to Ukraine, why move NATO into Eastern Europe? If Biden is unwilling to commit troops to Ukraine, is it not foolishness to pump up Zelensky against Putin? It is American policy to project force and influence wherever possible. NATO expansion is part of that policy. Another US policy is to zealously safeguard its area of influence and interest. In fact, the Monroe Doctrine was a declaration of a sphere of influence that comprised an entire hemisphere. There is nothing wrong with that policy, as every country follows these policies. The problem arises when a country begins to behave as if it alone is entitled to such right. In line with its policy of protecting its sphere of influence, the US declared war against Germany when Kaiser Wilhelm was attempting to enlist Mexico as an ally of Germany during the First World War. It should also be remembered that the US bombed the former Yugoslavia for 74 days exactly for the same reason that Putin cites now for attacking Ukraine, namely to prevent genocide. Then Russian President Boris Yeltsin lamented that had the USSR been still standing, NATO would not have dared to attack Yugoslavia to create Kosovo. The ghosts of Serbia have now come to haunt the US and NATO. By attacking Ukraine, Putin is paying the US in its own coin. Then, long ago, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Acutely conscious of its strategic weakness, the erstwhile Soviet Union secretly installed short-range nuclear-armed missiles at America's doorstep. To this Soviet adventurism, the US under President John F. Kennedy responded with a naval blockade and forced the Soviet Union to withdraw those missiles as they were considered posing a direct threat to the US homeland. Under President Joe Biden, the US is attempting to expand the NATO military alliance to Ukraine, which in essence is the doorstep of Russia. Consequently, Putin's deployment of ground forces on Ukraine's border is the mirror image of the naval blockade of Cuba in 1962. Like Ukraine, Cuba too was a sovereign state and had the right to seek support from anywhere it chose. In the case of Cuba, the Soviet withdrew its missiles, so a war was averted. But in the case of Ukraine, Biden refused to address the concerns of Russia, forcing Putin to attack that country to establish status quo ante. It also should be remembered that after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, Putin was the first foreign leader to call on then US President George W. Bush and offer support. He also facilitated the attack on the Taliban terrorist regime in Afghanistan, which had harbored the Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, the ideologue behind the attacks. It was clear at that time that Putin aspired to a security partnership with the United States. The jihadist terrorists who were targeting the United States were also targeting Russia. Nevertheless, the US continued its course of ignoring Russian interests. American actions in Syria, Libya, and Ukraine were seen by the Russian president as indirect attacks on Russia. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi were brutal dictators, but they were the only effective bulwark against Islamic State. American military aid to a supposed democratic opposition, the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, quickly fell into the hands of jihadists allied with the very Al-Qaeda that had perpetrated the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Egypt was lucky. Its military establishment remained intact after the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak. Consequently, after a brief spell of terrorist rule, dictatorship was restored in that country. All these actions the Russians could no longer tolerate. According to Putin, by refusing to give security guarantee, the US and NATO crossed a red line. Since Putin's major demand is an assurance that NATO should take no further members, and specifically Ukraine or Georgia, obviously there would have been no basis for the present war if there had been no expansion of the alliance following the end of the Cold War, or if the expansion had occurred in harmony with building a security structure in Europe that included Russia. Reflecting this sentiment, China's ambassador to UN, Zhang Yun, said, NATO's enlargement is an issue that cannot be bypassed when dealing with current tensions related to the Ukraine issue. One country's security cannot be obtained at the expense of another country's security. Ukraine may not have been welcomed into NATO anytime soon, but decades down the line, it could have proved to be a formidable military threat to Russia. So Putin considered nipping the threat in bud is the best. Besides, Putin viewed Biden and NATO as weak and indecisive. Any sign of weakness and indecisiveness on the world stage is dangerous. Shrewd operators like Putin would not let go such golden opportunity to settle old scores. In fact, more than anything else, it is the weakness and indecisiveness of Biden that emboldened Putin to attack Ukraine. By making it clear that the United States would not intervene with its own troops if Russia invaded Ukraine, Biden gave off the game and set the stage for the invasion. Diplomacy can work only if it is supported by real physical power. International law is useless without power to enforce it. Obeying force is the rule and obeying reason is an exception. At this juncture, an important question arises in my mind. Why the US has not considered the prospect of making Russia a NATO member? In private meetings with Russian leaders, Ronald Reagan used to tell them, "We hold the peace of the world in our hands. We must act responsibly so the world can live in peace." In line with this sentiment, the US should have brought Russia into the NATO military alliance. However, the US is not just unwilling, but rejecting any security arrangement that includes Russia. Why? This is a difficult question to answer. My answer to this question, therefore, may not find wide approval. Unlike Turkey, Russia is culturally and religiously a part of Europe. Turkey cannot be called a democracy anymore. It is occupying half of Cyprus and is at loggerheads with Greece. Turkish dictator Erdogan even called French President Emmanuel Macron mad. Turkey is largely a traitor to Europe and NATO. It has been allowing terrorists seamless transit to and from terrorist hotspots in the Middle East. If such a country can be a part of NATO military alliance, why not Russia? Russia is not a communist country anymore, nor is it a democracy as understood by the Europeans and Americans. But the same is the case with Turkey, which is a NATO member. Why Turkey is still a NATO member despite the country being ruled by dictator Erdogan, who is plotting against Europe? The reason is Europe has not only abandoned its Christian roots but feels ashamed of its Christian roots. The EU constitution has absolutely no reference to the Christian roots of Europe. Pointing out this decadence of Europe, in a 2013 speech, Putin said, "We see many of Euro-Atlantic countries are actually rejecting their roots, including Christian values that constitute the basis of Western civilization." In short, they are denying moral principles and traditional identities, national, cultural, religious, and even sexual. They are implementing policies that equate large families with same-sex partnership, belief in God with the belief in Satan. In short, Putin sees the West as being on a suicide mode. A best-selling author, Jonah Goldberg, has already written the requiem for the West in his book, Suicide of the West. While Erdogan facilitates the suicide of the West, Putin wants to avert that tragedy. Putin fears that cultural and religious suicide of the West would create a vacuum that would only be filled by forces more hostile to Russia. Eastern European countries like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania are live to this suicide mode of major European countries, and it is for this reason the opinion of people in these countries are favorable to Russia. Even the new NATO members, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, view Russia favorably. The ruling elite in the West wants to take the people down to their graves uninterrupted. But the entry of Russia into EU and NATO would not only terminate the suicidal mode but also restore the continent to its Christian roots. And it is for this reason the US and Europe are unwilling to bring Russia within the EU NATO political and security arrangement. And the NATO expansion is for keeping the suicide mode going and take Russia along. Naturally, Putin is fighting back to keep the suicide forces. Suicidal forces as far away as possible. Meanwhile, according to reports, the Russian forces are already in Kiev. A tweet by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky can also be understood to mean that Russian forces are already in Kiev. The Russians launched their invasion from three directions: east, south, and north. If the operation was about Donetsk and Luhansk, regions of eastern Ukraine, there was no reason for the Russian military to attack a wide range of targets across the country, including in the capital Kiev and the eastern city of Kharkiv. There is also no reason for sending troops to the capital of Kiev. The presence of Russian troops in Kiev could be for one of the following two reasons. One, Putin wants to occupy Ukraine, or two, he wants to decapitate the Zelensky government and install a government friendly to the Russians. Putin has denied plan to occupy Ukrainian territory. That leaves us with the second reason. However, some suggest that Putin could be planning to organize referendums in areas of Ukraine after the military campaign similar to the one held in Crimea in 2014. Meanwhile, Zelensky has called upon Ukrainians to defend their country and said arms would be given to anyone prepared to fight. His call is an indication of the desperate condition of his armed forces and that the war might end sooner than expected. In a video address, he also bitterly complained that Ukraine is left alone to fight against Russia and hit out at the West, saying, "Everyone is afraid." The bitterness on his face is palpable when he says nobody is helping. Anyone watching the video can clearly feel his anguish that he has been abandoned by the US, Europe, and NATO. Zelensky's predicaments have brought to fore a fact that no matter how much you stand with the US and NATO, they won't be there to support you and will always talk rather than letting their actions speak. And that to be an enemy of America can be dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. With the West unwilling to put troops on the ground, it is pointless for Ukraine to fight the massive Russian assault alone. It would be better to surrender than lose lives in an unwinnable war. According to reports, hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers have laid down their arms and went over to the Russians, and the Ukrainian border guards have also abandoned their positions. Such reports need not be viewed as propaganda because the speed with which the Russian forces have reached the capital of Kiev and other major cities is an indication that the reports are true. Besides, Zelensky's own warning that the Russians will storm the capital on Friday night adds credence to such reports. In a video addressed to the nation, he said, "I have to say absolutely openly, this night will be more difficult than the day. Many cities of our state are under attack. I hope and pray that the war winds up without much bloodshed and that Putin accepts Zelensky's appeal for direct talks where both leaders may reach an amicable settlement and bring the war to a swift conclusion. However, if all fail and Zelensky and his team are captured, Putin must treat them with honor and respect. They should not be put on show trial and executed. Thank you for watching. My name is Deva.